One of the aspects that gives students a lot of worry in their entire process of application for your master's degree is this notion around taking the GRE test. In fact, GRE in the US is considered to be the single largest indicator of future performance in the graduate program. So what that means is universities look at the GRE score as your future promise. How well may you be doing in that program if you were to give an admission to? So this is really an important aspect of your entire application. Now, whether or not if the GRE is a good score, what makes up a good score? Is it 305 or is it 310 or is it 320? We need to get a lot more clinical here because universities and programs no longer look at the combined score. They look at specifically the component scores. How well did you do in your quant? How well did you do in the verbal? And what were your respective percentiles? That's where they tend to spend a lot more time. So to determine whether or not you have a good score, you need to understand what the percentiles were of those individual components, the scores that you got. And secondly, the averages of those particular two scores that's part of the incoming class to your program. And universities publish that data so you can absolutely compare and check to see how you have done relative to your seniors who have just started that program. A percentile, just by the definition, just means the percentage of test takers who took that test but scored lower than your score. So the higher your percentile, the better your score is and the more competitive that you are. When we look at some of the data that was published by ETS, ETS stands for Educational Testing Services, that's the company that proctors the GRE tests. This data was published in 2018. They've looked at 1.7 million users and their scores, and what they found is the average is 150 for verbal and 153 for quant. But notice the standard deviation, it is 8 and 9 points respectively. What that means is there's significant variability in that score. And so you have users that have done exceptionally well and you have students that have done not so great. But where you also start to see some trends, a verbal percentile for a given score is much higher than the quant percentile. So as an example, if we look at a score of 160 in verbal, that equates to roughly 86th percentile. But that same score of 160 in quant, it's only 73rd percentile. What this means is students tend to do better in the quant, which is why for that given score it's a lower percentile, versus verbal, where for a given score it's a higher percentile. So now that we've understood the percentile concept, let's go back to our question. What is a good score? My personal opinion on this is we should all strive to be north of 300. We should cross the 300 barrier. It's a mental barrier, and so we've got to cross that. Anything north of 300 is deserving. Now, from there on forth, what is considered to be a modest score? And then we'll talk about a good score and an exceptional one. A modest score, most of the students from India will be going for a STEM designated degree program. And that's because we know for a fact that 40% is going to go for computer science and an additional 35% will do engineering. So in those STEM designated programs, universities will weigh the quant section slightly more than the verbal section. In fact, many of the universities expect a minimum of 160 in the quant section. So looking at the 160 for quant, and we place it there for just a moment, let's look at the verbal. On the verbal side, I would say you need to be at least in the 50th percentile or above, which would mean a score of 151. So you combine 151 and 160, and now you have a score of 311. So anything north of 310 is considered to be a modest score. So what is a good score? A good score is if you can be in the 18th percentile in both verbal and also in quant. The 80th percentile for verbal is a 158, and the 80th percentile for quant is a 163, giving you an aggregate score of a 321. So it's the 80th percentile that makes this a good score. And so generally, scores north of a 320 is considered to be a good score. So what's considered to be an exceptional score? Well, to be 90th percentile in perhaps both, that's considered to be an exceptional score. So to be the 90th percentile in verbal, that's a score of 162. And to be a 90th percentile in quant, that's a 167. So now it's a combined aggregate of 329. So if you have a 329 plus a 330 and beyond, that becomes an exceptional score. So this is how you understand what if it's a good score or an exceptional score or a modest score. But regardless, there are universities that fit every single band. It used to be the myth that you needed to score exceptionally well to get into a master's program, but now universities have made it much more accessible for international students to come along and procure a great education.